You found the skeleton. How would you tell people that this happens? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. When last we left off, Doug Batchelor was being wrong about egg beaters, comparing them to actual living organisms inappropriately, and about to launch into why he thinks that a bacterium is like an egg beater. So without further ado, here's Dougie.
If you separate the handle, and you separate the blender parts, and you separate the gear and the crank, they have no purpose anymore.
Red alert! Incoming irreducible complexity. Man your battle stations. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Red alert. All hands to battle stations.
There are so many cells of life where you've got a motor. Do you know that there are cells that propel themselves? They swim. They got tails that turn. And they got motors. And they actually have biological gears inside.
It's like one day someone told him the term bacterial flagellum was too fancy.
For them to all come together to work, they would all have to be complete. Any of these things incomplete as you see them now serve no purpose and they would not work.
Oh no, it's irreducible complexity. Who could have predicted this? Oh, right. Me. Anyway, there are more problems with irreducible complexity than you can shake a stick at. The first one is that it ignores all evolutionary mechanisms besides natural selection and mutation. But complexity can come about through neutral evolution and then become irreducibly complex. That is what I call the scaffold explanation for irreducible complexity in life. You see, an arch is a tricky thing to build, because if you remove any one stone from an arch, the whole thing collapses, and you can't simply build an arch one stone at a time, because it's not stable until it's complete. This means that an arch is irreducibly complex. So you might ask, how do people build them? Well, as you may have guessed, with scaffolds. The arch doesn't hold itself up until the final stone is placed and then the scaffold is removed. Similarly, functions can be split between independently mutating copies of a gene in a genome. Some of these mutations can make it so that some of the copies are less effective at certain parts of a given process, but good or even better at other parts. At this point, an organism has a series of functional genes for a given function, all of which are producing proteins of various efficiencies, but any one of which could stand on its own. This ability to stand on its own means that the scaffold is in place. But as each protein starts to drift away from the universal functionality, the scaffold is dropping. Eventually, these collections of proteins need to be present as a whole collection, or the function that was once done by one protein will suddenly cease to operate without the whole group present. This increases complexity and makes a system performing the function irreducibly complex. Another mechanism for the evolution of such systems is exaptation, where an organ or biochemical that was used for one purpose, where it evolved a complex structure via natural selection, will then be co-opted for a new function while retaining the previous complexity. An example of something that's supposed to be irreducibly complex, even though we have reduced forms of it, is the mammal blood clotting chain, which uses many proteins, while other animals get by just as well with a few blood clotting proteins. Another option is that neutral evolution can occur which primes an organism for a final mutation which allows a new and irreducible function. We can see this in the evolution of HIV group 1 from SIV-CPZ, that is, the chimpanzee simian immunodeficiency virus. In one SIV-CPZ lineage, during the early 20th century, there were a series of mutations in the gene for the VPU protein that didn't really do anything, but then a fourth mutation occurred, and it allowed the protein to antagonize human tetherin, which allowed it to infect humans, a new and much larger group of hosts. It didn't evolve stepwise with subtle improvements to tetherin antagonism. It just happened neutrally at first with no tetherin antagonism, but then, bam, one final mutation and there you go. Human tetherin is no longer a problem. A similar thing occurred in Escherichia coli in the now famous CYP+ line of E. coli in the Lenski long-term E. coli experiment. A series of mutations, none of which on their own had any function, taken together allowed a strain of bacteria in the experiment to metabolize citrate in the presence of oxygen, something that E. coli characteristically cannot do. So this was also macroevolution, as well as the evolution of an irreducibly complex trait. Now hold up, a creationist might say. That some irreducibly complex systems can evolve doesn't mean any of them can. To this I simply say, hey, that's a fun unfalsifiable argument you have there. The claim that evolution can't be true unless any and every irreducibly complex system has a known evolutionary history just means that until biology reaches omniscience, we would have to disregard evolution. And since we will never reach omniscience, evolution must be wrong, actually. I don't think I need to go into depth about why that unfalsifiable version of this hypothesis has no scientific merit and is properly disregarded.
So much of life is full of examples of things like this where they only operate as they come together in unison. There would be no explanation scientifically how all of these pieces would come together without a purpose
Neutral evolution really does cover most of it, and later, selection can help quite a bit.
Would this gear ever say, I'm going to grow into a gear because one day I'm going to marry up with blender pieces and a handle, and I'm going to make a cake?
Egg beaters aren't living things that reproduce with imperfect heritability, so it doesn't matter what they do when the question is about entities that are in fact living things that reproduce with imperfect heritability.
Would the handle ever say, I'm going to grow into this shape as a handle because I'm just anticipating that I'm going to fall into position someday with the gear and the blender parts, and we're going to whip cream?
Egg beaters aren't living things that reproduce with imperfect heritability, so it doesn't matter what they do when the question is about entities that are in fact living things that reproduce with imperfect heritability.
No, they all had to be together with a design for a purpose from the beginning. Cells are infinitely more complex than this egg beater.
Which is a point against design. Would anyone want a hand crank egg beater that used 40 score gears just on the grounds that it was thereby more complex? I sure wouldn't. That's just more points of failure, and more moving parts that reduce efficiency. And as we know with things like the simpler ribosomes of prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, or the vastly simpler blood clotting mechanism of many non-mammals, much of modern life could be vastly simplified with no obvious deleterious effect, and quite probably a slight beneficial effect. The complexity of life might suggest to the intuition that it had to be designed, but intuition is a terrible guide in science. Intuition tells you that the world is flat, the sky rotates around the Earth, that the rate of time's passage does not vary with relative speed, and that big heavy things fall faster than small light things. We know all of these things to not be true, despite the fact that they were the universal conclusions early humans came to when using their basic intuition about the world.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's just a stupid point.
And they have interworking parts that all have a purpose, and they would never come together spontaneously or accidentally to do that.
In the form of an egg beater? No. In the form of a biological system, we've seen irreducibly complex systems evolve in real time in recorded history under various levels of observation. Irreducible complexity is on the garbage heap of failed scientific hypotheses and theories with spontaneous generation, vitalism, phlogiston theory, the theory of the humors, flat earth, and geocentrism.
That's just one simple design. You've probably heard the example of the mouse trap before. I just wanted to be different, so I didn't use a mouse trap. I got an egg beater. But it's the same principle.
Ah yes, the mouse trap. This was the example used by Michael Behe in his book Darwin's Black Box, which is the book that coined the term irreducible complexity. I would say he invented the argument, except that Behe himself said in court in the Kitzmiller v. Dover trial, it was indeed based on the watchmaker argument put forth by William Paley in the 19th century. Behe likes to say that his idea about irreducible complexity and intelligent design are simply scientific, but again, in the same trial he said, and I quote here, the plausibility for the argument for ID depends on the extent to which one believes in the existence of God, end quote. As you might or might not know, one of the best things about science is it does not matter what your religion is as a scientist if your work is good, and it doesn't matter what your religion is to the conclusions of science, because they are based on empiricism and they don't care about your religion. If your idea only works with certain religious beliefs, it's not really science. Indeed, the judge in the case notes in his opinion, again quoting, as no evidence in the record indicates that any other scientific position's validity rests on belief in God, nor is the court aware of any such scientific propositions, Professor Behe's assertion constitutes substantial evidence that, in his view, as is commensurate with other prominent ID leaders, ID is a religious and not a scientific proposition, end quote. Rather hilarious, the court also found that Dr. Behe just ignored acceptation, the process by which a structure or system evolved to perform one function can be co-opted for another relatively unrelated function, such as the evolution of a leg into an arm into a wing in the case of the evolution of flight in birds. Further, Behe's favorite examples of irreducible complexity are the bacterial flagellum, the blood clotting cascade, and the immune system. And in court, extensive peer-reviewed studies were presented explaining how these things did in fact evolve, thereby falsifying irreducible complexity as a criticism of evolution, not just in the scientific literature, but also amusingly in court. Let me read the conclusion of the court. Quote, we therefore find that Professor Behe's claim for irreducible complexity has been refuted in peer-reviewed research papers and has been rejected by the scientific community at large. Additionally, even if irreducible complexity had not been rejected, it still does not support ID, as it is merely a test for evolution, not design. End quote. Lastly, I'll note that it was in what, as far as I know, is now a deleted live stream, that I personally got to ask Dr. Behe if he thought intelligent design could pass a court's test as to what was science versus what was religion based on how the test was applied in Kitzmiller v. Dover, a case that at the time was some decade and a half old. His answer was that no, it could not. Dr. Behe doesn't even believe this idea is scientific. I think I've beaten this already very dead horse enough.
And so then you also look in life, and by the way, this is called irreducible complexity.
Yeah, we know. It wasn't really hard to figure out.
Once you get it down to its simplest forms, You can't break it down any smaller. None of it works without the other. It all had to come together as a working unit.
Good thing such things can evolve. I guess science dodged that bullet.
There's no explanation in evolution for that. And by the way, that theory was developed by an evolutionist who said it doesn't make sense. Evolution doesn't make sense.
I wonder what Dr. Behe would think of being called an evolutionist, given how much time he has dedicated to attempting to discredit evolution, both in his books and in a trial over school curricula. Normally, creationists don't make up nonsense about each other. Interesting to see it happening here.
Then you have, nature is full of what you would call symbiotic relationships, where different plants and animals and creatures cannot survive without the help of coexisting in some way with others. They depend on each other.
This isn't in the least a problem for evolution. In fact, it's almost trivial for mutualistic symbiosis to evolve. Let's look at the example of Homo sapiens and Canis lupus. The association between the two species as cooperative rather than competitive started sometime at the end of the Pleistocene. And remember that if the claim is X could not evolve, all that needs to be done is to show a single plausible way for X to evolve, and that objection is overcome. And that is what I will give now, a plausible explanation. Wolves like food, and are generally less picky than humans. And just like wild wolves, foxes, and coyotes do now, they were certainly willing to steal food from human middens or trash heaps. Some humans are likely to shoo such animals away, and others leave extra food out. But it's pretty clear to see that humans are more wont to intentionally feed animals that they think of as friendly or cute. So those wolves that were the least aggressive to humans and who acted the friendliest and who took the cutest are the ones who are most likely to find humans a reliable source of food. They will also tend to be near humans, creating a bit of a physical separation between the human-following wolves and their human-shunning kin. So now, human-following wolves are more likely to mate with each other, and the population is under selection pressure to become more and more integrated with humans. Additionally, humans in groups with human-following wolves are inadvertently given an alarm system to protect against large and potentially dangerous animals, since the wolves will also be alarmed by such animals and will bark and growl to alert their packmates. This means that humans living with these proto-dog wolves will tend to be safer. From here, mutualism is established, and boom, next thing you know, we have Dobermans, Dachshunds, and Dalmatians.
There are plants and trees that just will not survive and pollinate without bees.
That's true.
But let's see if we have a plausible pathway for symbiosis between flowering plants and pollinators, including bees. So let's take a look at the earliest known flowering plant, Archifructus. It barely had flowers, and the flowers didn't really have petals, which are in fact modified leaves. It almost certainly did not have any dedicated pollinators, and it spread its pollen by the wind, as many plants still do. That's why if you get hay fever, you probably keep track of how much pollen is in the air. It's in the air because many plants still use wind dispersal for their reproduction. But pollen is very nutritious. In fact, some humans even eat it. So there will be few insects that would pass on a pollen meal. Incidentally, if an insect is eating pollen, it is very likely to have some of that pollen adhere to its exoskeleton or hair. If such an insect flies to another plant to eat pollen there, it will likely deposit some of the first plant's pollen, which may directly fertilize the second plant's seeds. This is more efficient than wind dispersal, and so there's now a selection pressure for pollen that sticks to insects better, as well as a selection pressure to attract insects. In the meantime, there's pressure on the insects to evolve ways to recognize and favor those plants with the best meals. So now we're seeing a pressure to create things like colorful petals, large sticky clusters of pollen, and for insects to develop good color vision and the ability to recognize flower species that will provide a good meal. But one thing that's even better than insects eating pollen is them leaving the pollen uneaten to be further used for fertilization, and instead for them to just take some of the plant's sugar. That's nectar, by the way.
There are plants that cannot survive without, there's a certain flower that it cannot pollinate without one particular moth that's got a very long proboscis that it uses, and it gets down and it goes just to those flowers. Just that flower needs just that moth in order to survive, and there's no scenario that you can create through history that would create an example for why that would be necessary.
In fact, the moth is called Xanthopan morgani praedicta, a subspecies of Wallace's sphinx moth from Madagascar. You probably find that subspecies name, praedicta, a bit unusual. Well, that moth feeds on the orchid Angraecum sesquipedale, also known as Darwin's orchid. This is because this orchid has an extremely long spur and cannot readily be fed on by any pollinators known to Darwin, but he used his knowledge of the evolution of mutualism to predict that a moth would be discovered with a proboscis long enough to feed from A. sesquipedale. I'm not sure why Doug thinks that using one of the most famous vindications of evolutionary theory is a point against evolution.
You've got there are birds and animals that coexist, and they protect and watch out for each other.
Yep, famously gray wolves and ravens are great pals, and ravens even play with wolf pups. Ravens also narc on coyotes near wolf packs, but what do the ravens get? Well, the wolves let them eat their scraps. It's essentially the same dynamic that created the dog from the population of wolves, Except in this case, the ravens seem like they might be the ones who are being domesticated by the wolves, despite being the smarter species.
You go in the ocean and you've got everything from the sea anemone that lives with the clownfish, and it stings everything but the clownfish, and the clownfish protects and cleans the anemone. And
the clownfish does not clean the anemone except in the sense of occasionally eating a damaged tentacle. Instead, it poops into its mouth, thereby feeding it. Isn't nature wonderful? And this isn't a hard relationship to understand either. First, clownfish are not just naturally immune to anemone stings. When encountering a new anemone, a clownfish will indeed be stung. In fact, it has to be exposed to the anemone's mucus for long enough for it to start producing similar mucus before the anemone will stop stinging it. And this process takes time and involves being stung. Why would this develop at all? Well, it's pretty clear that being resistant to anemone stings is useful, and while the clownfish isn't immune, it is less susceptible to the stings than are other fish. Similarly, anything that reduces the amount of stinging is also useful. So the ability to biochemically mimic anemones is also clearly useful. Further, it's not true that clownfish need anemones or vice versa. Both can live perfectly happily without the other. So this mutualism is one of convenience.
They just always seem to have had this relationship.
They don't even always have it now.
Little birds that ride on the backs of the rhinos and pick off their ticks.
Birds like to eat ticks, and most animals don't like having them sucking their blood. This one doesn't even really need an explanation. If someone came along and pulled the parasites off the part of your back you couldn't reach, you'd probably be pretty chill about it too.
I mean, I can just go through it now. You got in your belly, I hate to tell you this, but you got bacteria. But the good news is they're friendly bacteria. Let's hope they are.
Yeah, you do. And they digest things you can't, and you provide them with a nice place to live. I don't see why this would be a barrier for evolution. Do you think that Doug knows that just listing off examples of mutualism doesn't actually help him with the argument that mutualism is some kind of problem? It just isn't. It's easily explained just on Darwinian terms. Anything that evolution has had a handle on since the 19th century is probably not where you want to look to take the whole theory down.
And you need them to help you digest food. And if you take an antibiotic and it kills all the friendly bacteria, then you got to eat something like yogurt, which shouldn't be eaten by anybody because it's called yogurt.
Drink for a joke that didn't land.
And that's supposed to help give you friendly bacteria again. And there's so much complexity and interworking systems in life that to say this all happens spontaneously, it doesn't matter if you give it millions or billions of years. It becomes ludicrous.
Nope, it's actually a prediction of evolution by natural selection and neutral theory. This would be like someone finding absolute proof of the historical existence of Jesus and his resurrection and then claiming that that's evidence that Christianity is false.
And I'll get to that in just a minute, some of those other issues connected with that. Then you've got something called the law of entropy.
Wow, entropy. We really are hitting all the classics, aren't we?
This is the second law of thermodynamics.
That's true.
And basically it says that nature tends from order to disorder in isolated systems.
No, it doesn't, because the concept of entropy does not map well onto the word disorder, nor does a relative lack of it map well onto the concept of order. There are two basic and ultimately equivalent ways to conceptualize entropy. The classical way to think of entropy is how much energy is available to do work. Imagine an isolated internal combustion engine. It cannot gain or lose energy or matter to the outside. It has a supply of oxygen and gasoline or petrol, depending on where you live. Now, we know from the first law of thermodynamics that the total energy in the system must remain constant, but it can be transformed from one type of energy to the other. So imagine that the engine is turning a crank that will lift some weight. We can calculate how much work is done in the system by knowing the mass of the weight and the height to which we can raise it. Right now, all of this is high school physics level stuff, so I'm trusting most of you to follow it. I'll be using easy numbers for this, so work equals force times displacement, and force equals mass times acceleration. Put all together, we get joules, a unit of energy. So if we need to raise a 1 kilogram weight 1 meter over a second, we need 1 newton of force, which is how a newton is defined. Conveniently, this requires 1 joule. For this, I'm just ignoring gravity because it just complicates the math. If you want to include it, feel free to do the calculations and leave your answers in the comments. Just show your work. Anyway, we need to next look at the energy density of gasoline or petrol, which is 46 megajoules per kilogram. This energy is stored as chemical energy in the bonds between the atoms that make up the gasoline. When these molecules are oxidized, they release energy, which then runs the motor. Let's give our contraption a good but still reasonable efficiency. Let's go with 20%. So that means that for a kilogram of fuel, we can extract 9.2 megajoules of work. That means that we can raise our weight to about 9.2 kilometers, which is quite a way. But remember, I'm just using easy numbers. It seems pretty easy to see that this means that the other 36.8 megajoules of energy in our kilogram of fuel aren't doing work, and when we burn our last bit of fuel, there is no more work that can be done in the system. That energy is essentially entropy. The energy that is in the system that is now not useful for work is what entropy is. Now at this point, we hit more like undergrad physics levels of equations, and we don't actually have the information to calculate the exact value of entropy in the system in joules per Kelvin, but this is just about the concept. Okay, so let's think about the quantum concept of entropy. As I'm sure you know, normal matter is composed of atoms, which themselves are composed of electrons, neutrons, and protons, all of which are quantum objects from the atom on down. The exact state of the whole collection of them in a system is called a microstate. The observable classical scale properties of the same system are called the macrostate. You can think of it as analogous to the exact state of each pixel in a high-resolution image as the microstate, while what the image actually shows is the macrostate. Numerous microstates in an image with enough pixels can result in essentially the same image. Now think of a very high-resolution image of something very simple, like a checkers board. There are red and black squares, and they tolerate very few pixels that aren't just red or black before the image stops looking like a checkerboard. This means that the macrostate of a checkerboard image has a small number of microstates that can result in that macrostate, and so it is said to have low entropy. On the other hand, just pure visual noise can be approximated by a huge number of microstates, and so we consider it high entropy. Now, a system left to its own will tend to go to macrostates that have a higher number of microstates that can account for them, simply because there are more of them, and that's how the law of large numbers works. While the physics is over my head, actual experts in this field have worked out that whether you conceptualize energy as the energy in a system unavailable to do work, or as a number of microstates that can account for the macrostate, it actually works out to the same value in classical scales in joules per Kelvin. One thing you'll notice is that at no point did I even hint at something to do with order. That's because entropy isn't about order. Now, high entropy systems do tend to look disordered in many cases, and low entropy systems can look ordered, but ultimately, order and disorder in most cases are just subjective assessments made by humans, and nature does not care about these concepts. Further, as noted, the second law only strictly applies in isolated systems, that is, systems in which neither matter nor energy may enter or leave the system. So even if entropy did map well onto the concept of disorder, if the system under consideration can receive energy or matter from outside, then the law doesn't apply.
It's a law of life. Let's suppose that you've got a beautiful garden, and you got all the rows are carefully weeded, and everything is in order, and you got things stacked. You've got your corn, your tomatoes, and your melons, and your zucchini, and it's all growing. It's nice. You got some flowers just for good looks, but you die. You don't tend the garden, you don't water the garden. What happens to the garden?
You'll notice that this example doesn't actually have anything to do with the ability of the garden to do work, or in how many microstates can account for the various macrostates of the garden, which means that this is not entropy in the physical sense.
It'll all break down to the common denominator of chaos. You got a beautifully built house with a manicured yard, and the owner dies, and no one takes care of the house. What happens?
Yep, okay, same deal. I'm going to skip until there's a point being made instead of letting him ramble on about things that are at best just analogous to entropy, but don't actually involve him doing any physics to show how much or little entropy there is in any state for the system, why the system should be considered isolated, etc.
And so in life, where you see order and design and structure, there has to be an outside intelligence and power that is introducing that order and design, or just defies the second law of thermodynamics.
Okay, cool. I actually agree. If I see design, then there must be someone doing the designing. Well, the problem is that I don't see design in the sense of something that needs a specific designer, just like I don't see design in the swirling winds of a hurricane or the craters on the moon. As for order, remember, entropy doesn't just map onto order, so it's a non-issue. And finally, are living things isolated systems? No, in fact, they are not. So the entropy of living organisms does not have to increase with time. It can decrease as a result of the influx of energy. Further, just like the swirling clouds of a hurricane actually increase the entropy of Earth's atmosphere, living things increase the entropy of their environment by capturing energy and using it with limited efficiency in their own bioprocesses.
Then you've got a flood of evidence that we're surrounded with around the world.
Oh, okay. I kind of expected us to spend a bit more time on entropy, because even on the terms Doug here is using, that was a pretty weak argument. He didn't even try to tie entropy to evolution. He just asserted that because of entropy, things can't be orderly. But hey, sure, let's talk about the flood, I guess.
The fossil record around the world says that there was a great flood.
Funny how, as far as I can tell, no one ever comes to that conclusion because they looked at the fossil record. Rather, people who believe that all seem to have reached that conclusion based on their reading of a book of scripture, then decided that they needed to fit the actual evidence into the mold of their prior belief. And even people who do believe in a global flood often end up providing evidence against it, like the whole radioisotopes in the Age of the Earth team, aka the RATE team.
Doesn't our Bible tell us there's a great flood?
I couldn't possibly care less if it did or didn't. The question in science is, what do the empirical data show? It doesn't matter what's in the Bible, the Quran, the Mahabharata, the Ginza, the Guru Granth Sahib, Kitab al-Aqdas, the Eddas, the Book of the Dead, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, Dianetics, the Satanic Bible, or any other holy book. If you can't demonstrate your claim with data alone, and without reference to such books, then your claim is not a scientific claim. And I'm about science on this channel. If you want to say, I think there was a great flood as described in the Bible, and there's no scientific data to support that, but I believe it anyway, I don't really have a quarrel with you. I might think you're wrong, but so what? It's only when people start trying to overturn science that I really start to care. And I care because pseudoscience is dangerous, and believing any kind of pseudoscience, like creationism, makes one more susceptible to other kinds, like anti-vax, acupuncture, etc.
You know, when you talk about what caused the death of the dinosaurs, and I used to study paleontology. My dream, before I became a Christian, I wanted to do paleontology.
What the heck does that have to do with being a paleontologist? Doctors Mary Schweitzer and Robert T. Bacher are famously both real paleontologists and faithful and theologically conservative Christians. In fact, Dr. Schweitzer was a young Earth creationist before studying paleontology. Odd how that works, isn't it?
I had another friend, a girl in school, and she and I, we had dreams that we were going to be paleontologists and travel the world, dig up dinosaur bones, and fervently believed that everything was millions and billions of years old.
Let's see how that promising dream got crushed because of something other than the data.
And the theory used to be, and I could talk to you about the Tyrannosaurus rex and the Triceratops and the Stegosaurus and the Brontosaurus, and the theory was, what caused this mass sudden extermination of the dinosaurs? They said, well, a virus somehow developed.
That was never the consensus. It was just a hypothesis that never had much support.
Because it happens, you know, we don't know where AIDS come from. Some virus developed and just wiped them all out.
We do know where AIDS came from. HIV evolved around the 1930s from the chimpanzee simian immunodeficiency virus and then entered the human population probably via the bushmeat trade in Africa, which caused blood-to-blood contact between a chimpanzee body and a living human.
Then that didn't satisfy them. They said, no, there was a shortage of food. There was a famine. They all starved off.
That's actually still part of the explanation. Dinosaurs didn't all just die directly from the asteroid impact. Many survived that day to only starve later as their ecosystems collapsed.
And then they said, the birth of some of the primitive mammal rodents.
Well, rodents did evolve in the late Cretaceous, and yes, this was another hypothesis, but again, there was basically no evidence for some significant increase in the loss of eggs at all, never mind loss of eggs specifically from rodents. But what is the point of mentioning that there are now defunct hypotheses? That's not news. Is astronomy dumb actually because the flat Earth and geocentrism were both once leading ideas about how the Earth and sky work? I don't think so.
Began to eat all of their eggs, and it killed them all off. And they had all these theories, but the problem was the evidence, the fossils of the dinosaurs are in copious graveyards where they are covered with silt, which was once mud. They died in a cataclysm of water.
No, that's why those hypotheses were abandoned. First, it's not an accurate way to describe the fossil record of dinosaurs. Most dinosaur finds are not in big mass graves. They are not all found in some waterborne sediment, and some are found in subaerial ash and Aeolian sandstone. And further, virtually none of them are found in rocks that formed in a cataclysm, because in a shocking twist of fate, geologists can tell the difference between a flood-caused turbidite and, say, a slow-deposited shale.
So finally, after one excavation after another all over the world, the evidence could not be denied. There was some global catastrophe of a flood. So they said, they didn't want to say there was a global flood, so they say, an asteroid struck the Earth and caused a tsunami.
No, that isn't even close to what happened. There was no glut of catastrophically buried dinosaurs. In fact, virtually none of them are thought to be preserved after having been killed by the asteroid impact or any subsequent tsunami. Instead, right up until the actual interface between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, there are dinosaur fossils buried in mostly normal, non-catastrophic rocks. Instead, what was noticed was that there was an anomalously high amount of iridium, a very rare element on Earth that is significantly more common in asteroids, which are one of the only sources of significant amounts of it. Also, a paleocrater was discovered in the Gulf of Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula, which is full of things like shock quartz and breccia, things that form, in asteroid impacts. The shock in shock quartz is specifically from impacts. Further, tektites were found associated with the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, and tektites are bits of black glass associated with asteroid impacts. You see how everything is coming up asteroid?
Everything's coming up Millhouse!
And also, you see how the impetus for this theory wasn't the need to explain the taphonomy of dinosaurs. In fact, the taphonomy of dinosaurs really played no part whatsoever in the development of the asteroid hypothesis. Because again, the vast majority of dinosaurs are not buried in rocks that can be reasonably ascribed to any catastrophe, never mind a single one that caused their extinction. And here's where I point out that dinosaurs never went extinct, and all you have to do to see them is walk outside pretty much anywhere but the interior of Antarctica.
Which caused a flood.
No, it caused some tsunamis, but that isn't thought to have caused global flooding, nor is there any extensive flood deposit associated with the boundary in question. And further, the tsunami was strongest in the Americas and the west coast of Europe and Africa. Other parts of the world didn't get any tsunamis.
How many of you have heard that now? That's the going theory now.
I'm hoping everyone in the audience raised their hand.
Well, isn't that what the Bible says? Not an asteroid, but there was a flood.
No, because the asteroid didn't cause flooding, by and large. And what flooding it did cause was localized.
Well, they can't find that asteroid because it vaporized.
This is Barringer Crater, an asteroid crater I visited a couple times in Arizona. It's named for Daniel Moreau Barringer, who bought the land specifically to get at what he hoped would be a treasure trove of meteoric iron. Now, the reason I bring this up is that the crater is so recent that young Earth creationists have to put it post-flood. They can't just blame this on the flood or Noah or anything. So, did Mr. Barringer make it big with a crater-based iron mine? Well, no, because the meteor exploded into mostly microscopic fragments, which is typical. Big hunks of iron after a major impact are actually very unusual. We don't tend to expect to find actual bolides in major impact craters. So this is perfectly in line with expectations. The asteroid that ended the Cretaceous would not survive the impact, and there's essentially no chance of actually identifying anything as part of it.
But they say an asteroid hit the world, and it caused a flood, and it wiped them all out because they're all covered with silt in these mass graveyards.
You know, except that they're not, but okay.
And everywhere you go in the world, I remember I lived in Nageezi, New Mexico, 8,000 feet. Karen went there with me a few years ago. And they had these massive sections that you could find seashells everywhere.
Yes, eastern Arizona and western New Mexico were mostly underwater or in swampy conditions during the Paleozoic and into the Triassic. So this is to be expected. But the seashells are in normal marine deposits, not tsunamite or turbidite. They're in things like sandstone with marine crossbedding from tides and sand dunes. Higher up in the Triassic, we start getting fluvial and lacustrine deposits. That is, rocks that look just like the rocks we know form today around rivers and lakes. And hey, sea transgressions are not floods, nor are lakes and rivers.
You know, if you go up on the Mount Everest expedition at 20,000 feet, you're going to find giant clams.
No, you won't. You'll find large concretions and big, but not what I'd call giant clams, and more frequently brachiopods. And again, they're in non-catastrophic marine sediment, because the uplift of the Himalayas are due to the Indian plate pushing into the Eurasian plate. And guess what was between them before they pushed together? Oh right, ocean floor. In fact, the folding of the ocean sediment is easily visible in parts of the Himalayas, meaning that these fossils were not deposited on these mountains, they were deposited before the folding, because in order to fold sediment, it has to be deposited first. If you deposit sediment on a high relief terrain, it settles into the low parts. It doesn't just evenly coat the hills and valleys. Another thing about it, have you ever seen a pink Himalayan salt? Yeah, that's an evaporite deposit. You know, rocks that form as water evaporates, which is kind of the opposite of what a flood is. Nothing about the Himalayas is compatible with a worldwide flood, and most of it absolutely precludes such an event.
That is a long way from the ocean.
It is now, not back before the Indian plate hit the Eurasian plate, which also, interestingly, is the way that young Earth creationists think the Himalayas formed. They just pretended it all happened in the span of the one flood year.
Way up. And all over the world, we see evidence that things were radically changed by a flood.
It would be nice if any of this evidence were ever actually presented and turned out to be something other than bullshit.
You know how you got to church today, most of you? Dinosaur.
Unless they were riding ostriches or giant eagles, Lord of the Rings style, then no. They got here in fossil fuel-powered cars, most likely, and fossil fuels are made of plant matter almost exclusively, and most formed before the dinosaurs even evolved. Here's some trivia for you. The word fossil doesn't mean dinosaur remains, and the vast majority of fossils are not dinosaurs.
How many of you remember Sinclair Gas? What was the logo for Sinclair Gas?
A generic mid-20th century style cartoon sauropod.
The little dinosaur, right?
Yeah, I guess that's also a description.
You know why?
Because Sinclair is using the same misconception that Doug has about fossil fuels to sell gas. That's why.
They said that the oil came from a prehistoric world that was covered by a flood that turned into these incredibly copious amounts of oil and coal.
No one said that. Fossil fuel deposits are from swamps, primarily peat bogs. We have them today, and yes, fossil fuels are forming today. There was no flood involved, just deposition of dead plant matter faster than the plant matter can decay. That's it. That's all it takes. No flood needed. In fact, people burn pre-fossil fuel today. That's why peat is harvested. Now, that use of peat has decreased with the widespread availability of electrical power, but it's still used in some parts of the world out of either tradition or, more rarely, out of necessity.
Well, that's what the Bible says happened.
Got it. The Bible says that something happened that didn't happen. Not sure why that's the point he's going with, but oh well.
And what's interesting is, you know where you find a lot of that? Siberia?
Oh my God!
It's almost like plate tectonics is a real thing, and what's now Siberia wasn't always a frozen wasteland like Canada.
Yeah, once, ferns? They got woolly mammoths that died with ferns in their mouth.
Ferns live in Siberia today, but also those woolly mammoths are not associated with fossil fuels like oil and coal. That's from much deeper in the earth. It's like he's trying to have the stupidest take possible about everything in geology. It's honestly kind of impressive how badly wrong he can get even basic things.
Now it's Siberia, no ferns up there.
Really? Well then, explain Polypodium sibericum, the Siberian fern. Like it's actually called that, not just in its common name, but the scientific name of the species. I mean, look, this is a picture from Siberia. It's full of ferns. Has Doug Batchelor just never bothered to check if anything he says is true? It sure does seem like he's never done so.
Whole environment of the world was obviously very different from it is today.
I mean, yeah, but no one thinks that the current environment in any location on Earth is how it has always been.
They've got fossils of dragonflies. By the way, they look exactly like dragonflies today, except their wingspan is 24 inches.
In fact, we do not. We have giant griffinflies, or meganosopterans. That's an entirely different order of insects. Now, granted, it's probably a sister lineage to Odonata, where we find the actual dragonflies, but that's kind of like calling a beaver a primate. Meganosopterans were distinct from dragonflies in a few ways. The most obvious, perhaps, is that they had prominent cerci in at least some species, and a simple vein pattern in the wings with no pterostigma, meaning that they were worse at gliding than most other insects. This is another one of those circumstances where he could have just checked, but for some reason, no, he just didn't. And I'm not even sure that getting this right would negatively impact his rhetoric, so it's just being lazy, I guess.
Can you imagine those buzzing around? You'd be scared half to death they'd haul off your kids.
No.
A dragonfly? Can you imagine how big the mosquitoes must have been?
Well, the largest mosquitoes today can exceed 3 millimeters, and the largest species is usually identified as Toxorynchides speciosus, and is often known as the Australian elephant mosquito because of its range and size. They probably didn't get much bigger than this, as they are primarily nectivorous insects that also need a blood meal to reproduce. Both of these impose size restrictions. If a bloodsucker the size of an eagle were approaching you, you'd probably notice, and it would probably need a lot of nectar. Being small and hard to notice is the way to go for the mosquito. Active predators like griffinflies have an entirely different selection pressure in their niche. That some members of a group were once large is no indication that other particular members of that group must also have been large in the past.
Now, these are fossils, and evolutionists will agree with this, that they were there.
Yes, scientists are generally not in the business of denying the existence of fossils.
And the mammals, they had beavers 13 feet tall.
Castoroides, the largest thing that could reasonably be called a beaver, could get up to about 2.2 meters long. That's pretty damn big, but a far cry from 13 feet tall. But also, these animals are only found in what most creationists would call post-flood layers. So if the explanation for big animals is supposed to be pre-flood conditions, it probably doesn't work for Castoroides. But also, I'm not sure what about the current environment would preclude Castoroides from physically existing. Most animals don't go extinct because Earth physically can't handle an animal so big. They go extinct because of things like habitat loss, new predators, humans, etc.
The whole environment was different. There was vegetation. All the world was like a garden.
Well then, I shouldn't be able to find easily identifiable desert deposits in the geological record then. Except, oh no, the Coconino Sandstone and the Doggos Formation both famously preserve deserts with only sparse vegetation. Oh well, I guess I was wrong.
A lot more oxygen.
Large amounts of oxygen does indeed explain the existence of large terrestrial arthropods such as Meganeura and Arthropleura, but that's the Carboniferous. The oxygen found in the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic amber and in ice core bubbles are much more like oxygen levels today. So high oxygen levels cannot explain other large animals like Castoroides.
The environment was vastly different, and something cataclysmic happened to our world that was worse than an asteroid. It was the flood of Noah. It says the heavens split. Water came out of the earth in great jets.
Cool story, but we're going to need a lot more than just big beavers and bugs to make that a plausible event. Really, what we need is a globally extensive and correlated layer of turbidite. But, we don't have that. Instead, what we have are extensive layers that cannot have formed in a flood, like limestone, Aeolian sandstone, subaerial tuff, evaporites, etc., etc.
Continental drift. All these things changed. And the fossil record tells us exactly what the Bible says, that there was a major change about 4,000 years ago.
No, remember that he's already identified the end Cretaceous as his big change, which means his use of Castoroides, a Pleistocene mammal, odd, but whatever. The thing is that there isn't really a big change in the kind of rocks being deposited on either side of the boundary, called the KPG because in German Cretaceous is spelled with a K. The difference is in the biosphere, not the lithography. And further, just sedimentology alone precludes this from being only a few thousand years ago. Just the Green River Formation, an Eocene lacustrine collection of rocks known for exquisite fossils, would have taken too long to form to fit into just 4,000 years, given that it preserves far more varves than that, and those are annual depositional layers in lakes. We don't even have to turn to radiometric dating to know that the young Earth timeline simply does not work. And that's why even early geologists before radiometric dating tended to put the minimum age of the Earth at tens of millions of years, and the age of the Mesozoic at least a few million years ago.
That totally disrupted the world. There's a flood of evidence that supports that.
Weird how none is ever produced.
What about the living fossils?
I'm predicting we get the coelacanth, horseshoe crabs, maybe sharks, and maybe triops. Although for some reason triops doesn't seem to get any love from creationists, which isn't fair. They're very cool, and very basal. But let's wait until next time to see if my predictions are right. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and let me know in the comments what you liked about it. If you didn't like it, again, hit dislike and let me know in the comments what you didn't like. Either way, I hope you subscribe to the channel and use the bell icon to turn on all notifications so you're always notified when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Tapioca Weasel, Denny5252, Elleron Teller, Phil Rivara, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostic Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babby, Monkey They Them, Mrs. Spexinder, San, Sphincter of Doom, and the Venerable Bede. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters. And either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Now, if the annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.